The first day was always the hardest. At least, that is what Thrus had been told by emigrations when he'd left his hive. It wasn't uncommon for Kai-Ting to leave and explore the wider universe, and as a matter of fact, they had a decent rapport with most sentient species, but as a hive-based species, they usually didn't do great for a few days. Thrus, considered sturdy by his people, had assumed he'd be able to simply push through such homesickness, but his first day, as promised, was hard. The first of several problems was that he couldn't hear the reverberations or light creaking that accompanied his people when they moved. He hadn't considered that it would be something he would miss, but now that it was gone, he found himself longing for it. The second was that the several races around him all had dramatically varying body temperatures. Kai-Ting was sensitive to heat, more so than most other species. Only the reptilian crowd boasted a stronger sense for it. As a result, Thrus found himself bombarded on all sides by waves of heat he'd have normally associated with fire, or chilling cold he'd assumed to be dead bodies. It had made it impossible to sleep the whole time he'd been here. However, by far the worst issue was who was hiring today. Coming to the Intersystem Employment Office had been recommended to Thrus when he left. Theirs was a job that allocated manpower between systems, allowing both the best use of skill sets and an otherwise difficult cultural exchange between more reclusive races. Every day, employers from different planets would come and look over applicants, and they'd choose those who were applying for jobs they needed filled. Thrus had applied to be a part of an armored resource shuttle, and had even increased his chances of employment by not putting any restrictions on preferred employers, only for this to happen. Today was the first that humanity had been selected to join the employment office. They were looking for species that could go in and out of their hell world to ferry the insanely rare work goods that their kind produced. They wanted laborers, which Thrus wasn't. They wanted guides, which Thrus wasn't. They wanted operators, which Thrus was the only applicant. Well, look at you, Shiny. Know any human languages? Asked the Earth Reviewer. Thrus assumed it was a he, based on a racial pamphlet he'd read prior to their being let in today, was a human, tall by Kai-Ting standards, towering even, but from what he'd seen was on the short side of humanity. He wore what looked like cloth garments, but they were so heavy and thick they may well have been armor, good armor. Kai-Ting commandos, who had some of the best energy-based weaponry in the galaxy, would have a hard time getting through it. His head had yellow fur cut so short Thrus could see the hide underneath, and eyes like green gems. His pale skin looked hardened by weathering, which would be fatal for a Kai-Ting, but seemed normal among the humans he'd seen. And not individually, sir, but my translator has been downloaded with the several known to the Republican Dominion. Will that work? Aye, that'll be fine. Work experience, asked the human, who the other two humans present called Skipper. None intergalactic, sir, but I directed thousands of my own people's ships on our own planet, even between colonies. The human's mouth changed shape, and at first Thrus was alarmed, but he made no hostile moves, only continued to speak. Not really trying to sell yourself much. You have a problem with the job, or just don't have much of an ego? Before Thrus could explain that he wasn't familiar with humans, one of the other humans spoke up. Hey, Skipper, are we really going to bring the bug on board? He asked, seeming to try and speak secretively, but the human voice being too terribly loud to hide. You know Janice is going to give you hell if you don't let her know first. HMPH, Janice isn't in charge of hiring, though, is she? Asked the skipper. We need operators, and is the only one we've seen who hasn't put no humans on his application. We need to seriously consider it. But Dash! I've made the call, Sergeant. His voice raised high enough that other races had to hunker down in fear or at least cover what passed for ears. Thrus, miserable that he'd actually thought humans were just a story told to scare weaker races and so hadn't excluded them from his hiring prospects, spoke up. We Kai-Ting are fairly adaptable as worlds go, but what I've heard of the human homeworld is concerning. If it is true you operate in climates higher than 30 degrees Celsius, then I'm afraid I will be physically unable to join your crew. Below 10 was also a problem, but no sane species would operate in such conditions, so he didn't even bother bringing it up. 30 and higher is an uncommon Dash success, but we'll be operating out of a temperature-controlled spaceport on the moon. Failure. What's the hold-up, Skipper? asked another human, and before Thrus had the time to appreciate his unique voice, he was alarmed by something else. The human Thrus was looking at had clearly been burned in some sort of way. Its skin, rather than the normal pinkish hue of its brethren, was a dark, brackish brown. In terms of texture, it was rough, and it gave off a scent different than the others, one Thrus assumed was resultant of his terrible injuries. Even his hair was affected. The poor thing, it had the same tight black curling that one might see on charred bodies or grass. Thrus couldn't help but stare, marveling at human resilience that would continue to work in spite of such injuries. In fact, if nearly any other race was burned as badly, they'd have died, so that was pretty impressive too. "Sir," answered the skipper, "the applicant has no intergalactic experience, and his background lists no military experience. I'm concerned he may not integrate well with the crew." I see," the captain said in return. "However, this is a civilian vessel, and we're shipping civilian goods. Just because most of us are former service doesn't mean it's a requirement." The captain slapped the skipper on the shoulder, and from the sound, Thrus knew such a slap may well have knocked him unconscious, if not killed him outright. To have such power, even in his state, humans really are impossibly powerful. The captain took the pad the skipper had been using to review candidates from him, and looked it over himself. Thrus Tillian Tuck of Chictua, you're Kaiting, right? Not Kortu. Thrus was impressed he'd been able to identify him from the visually similar species. Most had trouble doing so. Sir, and... HM? Yes? Something wrong. It's just... Thrus wasn't familiar with human culture. How could he be? However, his or this person serving his position in spite of all he'd apparently suffered could not go unstated. "I cannot help but admire you, sir," he admitted. All of the humans, the captain included, cocked their heads at him, though he could not guess the meaning of the gesture. To captain a ship in spite of your injuries. Thrus gathered up his courage and his warrior spirit. This man deserved his all. It would be an honor to serve under such a distinguished leader. So... The captain had difficulty articulating. He shook his head violently, likely to clear his thoughts. "Wait, what injuries are you talking about? Can you see my dash? Your skin, sir? To operate a ship with that much of your body being badly burned, I've never heard of such a resilient species." His compliments were met with silence. The humans were all staring at him, eye coverings pulled back all the way. Did something he said cause them to want to examine him closer? Thrus, though, didn't have time to contemplate the gesture, as two of the humans, Skipper and Sergeant, slowly bared their teeth at him. Realizing he had offended them, Thrus fell to his belly, using 2 of his 6 limbs to cover the back of his head in fear. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have mentioned it. I am Dash." What had he been thinking? It was like walking up to one of his own kind and saying, "Hey, I think your missing limbs are really neat." However, what happened next was nothing like what Thrus had expected. "Heh, hee, ha ha ha," loudly, uncontrollably, the 2 humans beside the still silent captain began to erupt with sound, barking their strange noise so loudly that many of the gathered races pulled away in fear. Had Thrus initiated ritual combat? Were these super predators going to rip him apart to establish dominance? Oh, Thrus should have listened to his parents and stayed home. Oh my God. He thinks Dash. Holy shit. I changed my mind. We have to hire this guy. There was moisture gathering in the sergeant's oculars. This is the best day of my life. Holy shit. Is it racist if it's a bug? The one called Captain, suspiciously silent, leaned forward and nearly whispered to Thrus, "Welcome aboard. You're in the command room. With me.